Hi there, John Wilkinson again, and this is the last of my talks on the nature of World War One. And this talk is going to focus on the impact of the war on women, with a particular focus on their roles and on their status. So let's see what we find. And so the impact of war on women. Now, it is likely that roles and status will appear in a question focused on women and war. It's not a guarantee, but it does come up more frequently than not. And there's a lot to think about here. Roles, I think, are pretty straightforward. Wives, mothers, jobs, paid or voluntary. I'm not saying the roles themselves are straightforward. There's a lot in there, as you will see. But I think they're the areas you want to have some notes on in preparation for the exam. But I would think about what may have changed with regard to those domestic roles. For example, women in wartime become, in effect, single parents. The menfolk are off at war. And maybe they're even working single parents. So I think there's a lot there to think about and for you to write about. As for jobs, they may have been on the home front. They may have been more directly linked to the war effort, or they may actually have been in military service. It depends on the war you're looking at. Status is not so straightforward. Status is the regard in which a person or a group of people, for example women, is held. The importance, the admiration, or the respect given them. So think about those things. Think about how much the state and society saw women differently before the war and after the war. Think too about the way they are regarded by the law. This will include things like equal pay or voting rights. How far men regarded women differently before and after the war, and how women perceived themselves differently. And with both roles and status, think about wartime and post-war. Did things change during the war and change again after it? As for impact, clearly you're going to be looking at both positive and negative effects. But you might also want to consider these four fields. The family, and I've looked at that to some degree already. The roles of women on the home front, on the battlefield, if it's relevant to your war. And what about in World War II, resistance movements? So again, it's maybe a little bit more involved than you might think. You can consider post-war effects too, as I've said. Jobs. And when we're looking at impact and not just roles and status, what about war widows? If a man dies in the war, he might well be married. That leaves a widow behind, and maybe a widow with children. And for the single men, and indeed for the war widows, given the fact that so many men died in World War I and in World War II, there was a large number of unmarried women in society in the decades after those two wars. There's a lot of sociological history there for you to think about. And then, of course, we have the issue of women gaining the vote. You need to be aware of women's roles as well as status before the war, and whether there were signs that these were already changing. I think it's a useful thing to cover in your introduction and earn marks straight away. This way, and I think only this way, you can reach a judgment as to how far war was a catalyst for change, or whether it was more a matter of accelerating a process that was really already underway. So let's have a look at two questions. These two are both from paper 2. The effects of war on the role and status of women were mostly beneficial. Discuss with reference to 2 wars. Evaluate the impact of 2 20th century wars on the role and status of women. So 2 questions where the role and status of women is highlighted in the question. But the time frames are broad, and because of that, the impact of each war that you choose on women's roles and their status may be considerably different in degree or in the manner of the impact. Take, for example, if you're covering World War I and the Vietnam War, a big difference in those wars. Each war could be considered separately. Half your essay on, in my example, World War I, half your essay on the Vietnam War. But you could also take a thematic approach. For example, economic, social and political. For economic, you could consider roles, i.e. jobs. For social, you could consider status, how society saw women. And political, I think status as well, the vote. Or roles in politics. But make sure you are always clear, if you take a thematic approach, which war you're referring to. Also, post-war impact can be included, so long as you make a clear link to the war. An awareness of the roles and status of women before the war, I think, is necessary. Now, in answering any question, you should come to a conclusion. And whereas the first question will focus on whether the effect or impact was beneficial or not, the second question gives more options. You can still go for beneficial or not, but you could go for positive or not, great or not, lasting or not, and I'm sure you can come up with other choices. The choice is yours. But the effect or impact may have been different with regard to roles as to status, and you need to make that clear. Here's another question. With reference to 2 20th century wars, each from a different region, compare and contrast the effects of war on the role and status of women. Another paper 2 question. And there's a lot packed in to the question, but that can be useful for you, so don't worry about that. But think carefully about what's in the question. You need to refer to 2 20th century wars. They must be from different regions. You are instructed to compare and contrast the effects of war on the role of women. And you are instructed to compare and contrast the effects of war on the status of women. So the shape of an essay plan is really done for you. Roughly half an essay on roles, with roughly half of that on comparisons and half on contrasts. Half an essay on status, with roughly half of that on comparisons and half on contrasts. But how much they compare and how much they can contrast will depend on the wars you choose. As with the other essays, post-war impact can be included so long as you make a clear link to the war. And an awareness of the roles and status of women before the war I still think is necessary. Again, you should come to a conclusion. And whereas you will assess whether they compare more or whether they contrast more, it is still the effect you are examining. So was it beneficial or not, positive or not, great or not, lasting or not? And the effect may have been different, again with regard to roles as to status. So the last question. With reference to any two European countries, compare and contrast the impact of women of the First World War. This is a paper 3 question. It's another compare and contrast question, but this time with one war, but two countries. And there's no reference to roles and status. Though, of course, there is nothing stopping you, especially if that's what you've been revising, from including them in your answer. As with the other essays, post-war impact can be included so long as you make a clear link to the war. And an awareness of the position of women, in other words, their roles and status before the war, I still think is necessary. But given that you are considering the impact of the same war on two European countries, and so a shared culture between those two is most likely, I would think you will find a lot to compare, and the contrast will be a matter of degree. That's okay. Don't worry about that. Make it clear, make it a strong point in your essay. And in the post-war world, I think a lot would depend on whether a country had won or not. So there you are, my examination of the possible questions you might face on the impact of women in wars. And I really hope it was useful for you. So there we have 3 talks now on the nature of World War I, looking at why it was won and lost, looking at the impact of technology on the war, and looking at the impact the war had on women. I hope the 3 of them have been useful, because they are subjects of specific questions that you might find in your exam. But as always, thank you for listening. Cheers.